Good afternoon. We are at 4:31 and we're ready to begin Chapter 9. As you can see on the screen, integrated models for understanding organizations and for leading and managing change. So let's get right into this. The question we really want to ask here is, why do we use models? Why do we have to use a model to follow to implement change? Well, I guess the simplest reason, at least the simplest reason that I can think of, is that we use models to help channel our thoughts. And the models provide known language that we can relate to, and not the least, or not the last, help us move to action. So this is the last thing down here at this last bullet. It's instead of thinking about how we're going to do change, moving us to doing change. So that's why we use a model. I mean, if you prefer to use this as a thought of a roadmap or a blueprint, I guess that's probably the best way to think of it. But that's why we have models. A model will also give us a sample representation of how an organization is structured. And remember what it says here, the model is usually metaphorical. We can transpose that to our own organization, and it should have some application for us. And then remember here, the last thing about the organism metaphor: input, throughput, output. And that is the important thing that we want to look at when we change. And if we're changing something that is as radical as the entire system or the entire organization, because we're going to change input, throughput, and output. So we have to go back to the first slide we saw, and we have to have something that not only tells us how to think about change, but also how to implement change. Now, as far as I'm concerned, we discussed most of this in the early slide. And this is just giving us a little bit earlier slide, I should have said. And this is just giving us a little bit more food on the table, if you will, to help us think through this process. So we're talking here now about strategy that comes into play a little bit more than perhaps what we talked about in the earlier slide, and also structure. Those are the two things we have to be most concerned about if, and this is the if part, if we're thinking about changing the organization as a whole, the system as a whole. Now, the question that should come to your mind is this applicable, this kind of thought process, applicable to groups or teams, or departments or divisions, however you want to put that? And I would answer to you, yes, that's correct. Is it applicable to individuals? Well, I probably won't give you a qualified yes, but I would more or less say it probably is. Chances are it is. I know that's equivocal, and I can't get away from that, but I think that's what it was. But I think, again, what we're looking here for is the last bullet down there. This gives us a guide of how to put our plan into action. Now, again, Burke is coming here and he's asking us a question, a rhetorical question in a way, and that's why are we going to use an organization model? Now, remember what we said before, we're going to use an organization model because it tells us, or it gives us some idea of not only the how, but the why. Well, maybe I put it incorrectly. Maybe I should have put it the other way around. The why organization change is needed, and then the how to implement. So I think the things we have to be careful about here, what this particular slide says, is that the model, whatever model we use, is only as good as its construction. He uses the word components here, and that's fine. I think the next thing is, and I use the word construction, I'm using it as he uses it down here in the parentheses, how we have this arranged, how it's selected. So we have to use this why we want to do this change, and look at this model and see if that fits in this why part, as well as it tells us this how part, how to implement this plan. Now, obviously, we're using a model, and a model is just that. It may not fit everything, but it should give us a starting point. And if we have a starting point, and then we have some benchmarks, for lack of a better term, along the way, we can get our minds around not only the why we want to do the change, but how we're going to implement it. Remember, Burke made this statement early on about the use of metaphors. A metaphor is a paradox, and it has the ability to give us insight into what we're doing, but at the same time, it can limit what we're doing and what we're seeing and what we're thinking through the process. Why? Because it's a metaphor. And a metaphor, while a metaphor is we're using something to explain something else, it has limitations. It has limitations because the metaphor is created by a human or humans. And every human, regardless of what he or she thinks of him or herself, has limitations. So we have to be careful about that we're actually seeing what it is we want to, not what we want to see, what we need to see, and we're not being precluded from seeing what we need to see. Now, he mentions here that models are based on Levitt, who produced his in 1965. And you can look at his model. We're going to get to it graphically here in a second, but you can read a little bit more about his model in the text. Notice what Burke is saying here, that the model is descriptive. Now, I want to digress from this just a second and say that that's okay. You remember, you have to stop and think about this, because if a model is prescriptive and you're going to take that model on, then you have to follow that model. And that model may not be exactly what you want. So descriptive is okay. Now, a lot of people tell you descriptive isn't okay, that you need a prescriptive document, and that's fine. But I think in this case, you really need something that describes the why and the how. You're the one that's going to have to do the how. This model is not going to do it for you. Or if you hire a consultant, the consultant's not going to do it for you. The consultant's going to come in and write a report and leave it and collect his or her check and say, thank you very much. You have to do the work. So here we talk about a couple things down here before we get to the graphic. And we talk about task here, purpose, people, employees, technology. Think of things as equipment, as well as things like personal computers and the mainframe and things of that nature, and structure how we're going to put things together. And remember that if we're doing this and we're thinking about a total system change, then one change is going to affect another. And so then once that one change affects another, we have something like a domino effect, if you will, and everything is going to be changed because we have this interdependence. So this is just Levitt's organizational model. We have structure, people, tasks, and technology. And by the way, I think that we're showing this as a somewhat of a diamond shape. I got just escaped me for a second. The first thing came to my mind was square, and I didn't want to say square. Diamond shape, and that's fine. And I think the reason we want to use a diamond shape for something that has lines to it as opposed to a circle is we can see levels or places where these different agents, if you will, interact. Now, he talks here about Weisbro's model, and we're going to see this shortly. But what this tells us here, and notice that, again, he's using the organism metaphor, but also using air traffic controller as he or she looks at the monitor in front of them and sees the blips, which depict the incoming traffic, as well as the outgoing traffic. So what we have to be careful here is he mentions at the bottom are the trouble spots. Maybe you want to use the term hotspots. Maybe you want to use the term the spots or the places in the organization that we change are going to give us the greatest impact or the biggest bang for our buck. Those are the things we have to be cognizant of. Those are the things that we have to pay closest attention to. Now, that does not mean to say, and I don't want to leave the impression that the other places are not important. They are. But if these are places that, for lack of a better term, everybody sees or most people interact with, those are the places we have to pay most attention to. Now, this is the organizational change model. I'm going to try to blow this up a little bit for you. You can see this in your text and give us some kind of idea here of a little bit what we're talking about. This is Weisbro's 6-box model. And you'll notice it is in 6 boxes here. And talks about purpose and structure and rewards and mechanisms and leadership. Those were 5 outside boxes, and what's in the middle? Leadership. And notice what is going around here, but I think, of course, we have the environment playing a big part here. I think, and this is just me thinking, that we ought to have some connection here between the leadership and these other boxes, because if you look at what's in the middle of the leadership box, it asks us a question. Does someone keep the boxes in balance? Well, the answer to that question ought to be, it may not be the leader's responsibility to keep the boxes in balance, but it is his or her responsibility to see that someone or someone's keep those boxes in balance. Now, Burke comes next and gives us the organizational change models of Nadler and Tushman. And notice again, we're back here to the open system metaphor. And then we have what we have here as fit, must be a fit between pairs of inputs, and especially between components in the transformation process. Well, you know, I don't want to sound like I'm being smart aleck here, but we ought to think of that as a given. If we don't have a good fit between the pieces or the parts or whatever we want to call them going through the transformation process, then we're not going to get the transformation we want. We're going to get a transformation, but it's not going to be the right one. So that's a very important thing to stop and think about. Notice he also says here that organizations are dynamic, and there'll be some, and we need to understand that. Why it wasn't articulated earlier in some of the things we've talked about, I can't exactly give you a good answer. But organizations, just like an open system, and we've already said they're open, organizations like an open system are not static. They're changing. They have to. So yeah, we have to see that. And then this is their model. I'll blow this up just a little bit here for you. Please find a plus button. And notice here he's talking about the inputs over here to the left and the strategy and then a task, etc., and it goes over to the outputs. And here, what we're saying here is that what is it we're working on? Inputs and outputs deemed. We want the outputs deemed over here at the end to be both in the proper quantity and in the right quality. If we don't have them in the right quantity, we're not producing as we say we are. And then if they're not in the right quality, we're not only not producing what we say we are, we're not putting out the product that we claim that we're putting out. So we have to be careful about that. And in the middle here, and they don't mention this when we go through inputs into transformation process and outputs, there has to be some kind of control system in here so we can change what's going on if we find out that there's some problem in this transformation process. The last thing we want to do, and I'm only talking here now about quality, the last thing we want to do is get to the output and find out that we have a lot of stuff that doesn't meet specifications, and all we've done is created a larger amount of scrap. That is not really good for us. So we need to diagnose the fit between components and output, as we've said before, and components and input. And then there is some congruence. Don't discuss good and bad. You know, they have to be separated. And it's very important that we think about this. So it's also important that we look at the input as history, what we are, what we've been, what we intend to continue to be, and then strategy, because strategy plays a great part in what we're doing here at the beginning. If you think about inputs as simply being raw material, our strategy has to be to get the best raw material we can get, purchase the best raw material we can purchase, to have the best output that we could possibly have. Now, we talked about diagnosis before, or at least I think we did. Nadler and Tushman said we have to, number one, identify the system, and number three, diagnose the state of fit. But what we have to do up here at step 2 is very, very important. And that is not only determining the key values, but ensuring that we have the correct, I didn't mean to say values, I meant to say variables. Make sure we have the correct variables. If you remember when we were talking about the alpha, beta, and gamma change, one of the things that it said at the end was determining the variable to be identified is critical, or perhaps they used the word crucial. And that's what we're talking about here. We have to make sure we have the right variables to investigate, I guess is the best way to put that, and make sure we're doing what it is that we want to be able to do. Okay. Now, Mark introduces to Tishi's technical, political, and cultural framework. He says it's similar to what we've seen in the past, but focuses more on organization change. Again, he's talking here about 9 levers of change. Notice what he says next, that a lever for management is not shown because Tishi assumes that management's always being accomplished, or perhaps put it a better way, that there are people in place to manage what needs to be managed. And then here's this framework model. Blow this up just a little bit. And I think we can look at this pretty easily and see what's important here. Now, I'm doing this based on importance from top to bottom. Other people may want to say something a little bit different. But the reason I'm doing that, again here, remember we go back to what we've seen before, input, environment, history, resources. And then the next thing we saw, I cut several slides ago, was strategy. Mission and strategy for any organization is set at the top. That's what those people are paid for, among other things. So while there is a great hue and cry of changing, of making change instead of from top down to somewhere either bottom up or between top down and bottom up, or to have some kind of a, what do I want to say here, a melding of the two thoughts. So you're getting some of each, and that's fine. But nobody at the bottom rung of an organization sets mission and strategy. That they're not paid for that. And most of the folks at the bottom of the organization are not schooled in formulating strategy and writing a mission statement. Now, that's not to diminish those folks. That's just not in their skill makeup. But if it is, then they need to be someplace other than where they are. And I don't mean that to be smart aleck. It's just a statement of fact. What I'm saying here is we need to have people that have the requisite skills and abilities and education, et cetera, in the right places. And we don't need to have people with those skills someplace else. And I'll give you an example as I'm digressing. But there was a study, some research that was done in the earlier part of the 20th century, sometime I think in the 1920s and 1930s, where there were a number of black men who were college educated and they were working in menial jobs. I've seen janitor, but it could have been other jobs than that. And the statement was, and of course this was terrible research. The statement was, well, they're satisfied with the jobs they're in. That has to be a bunch of hogwash. So what I'm saying here is if we do have people down there at the bottom that have the skills and abilities to formulate strategy, they don't need to be at the bottom. They're in the wrong place. And we talked about this before, about having the right fit between the person coming in for the job and the vacant job. So this gives you a little bit of what Tishi's doing here, graphically displayed. Now let me bring this down a little bit. So anyway, what Tishi is saying, his three primary systems that we talked about before, technical, political, and cultural, cut across each of the levers. And I think we should think about that. It's important. These are, I'm not going to say there are other parts of a framework, anybody else's framework, that are not just as important, but each of these, and I think we should be able to see this at work, these three at work, in the organizations where we're employed: technical, political, cultural. So we have to have a good alignment between these three and the 9 levers if we expect change to occur the way we want it to occur and have envisioned the process to occur. And then this is a graphic display of Tishi's matrix. Excuse me, I just lost my train of thought. I apologize. And showing these things, and then you have to obviously you have to fill in the boxes and have the amount required organization component change. That all has to be down there. And then he has this on a score system, a max of 36. I think we don't need to be as concerned about any particular model, other than we have to pick the model that we think is going to help us do what it is we need to do. Remember, the model isn't going to do it for you. Or the people who develop the model, assuming they're still alive, are going to magically appear at your doorstep and say, we're going to work you through this process and take care of this change. It's just not going to happen. You know, the people who are going to do the change, to implement the change, are the people that work in the organization, nobody else. Now, yeah, okay, somebody can buy the organization out, new people can come in, they can do all that. But that's an entirely different type scenario. You're going to get a model to try to help you understand what it is that you need to do, and give you some kind of reason, help with the reasoning of why you need to do it, and give you some kind of idea of how to do it. But the implementation, the doing part, belongs to you and to no one else. And so that you have to do it that way. And you have to think about these models, as I've said before, as helpers or blueprints. You know, you can get a blueprint to show you how a building is supposed to be built, but the blueprint doesn't build the building. Now, I know this sounds like I'm being smart aleck again, or I'm talking at a level somewhere beneath your intelligence. I don't mean to do that. I mean to make a point that models, blueprints, and roadmaps are great tools to have. You need them. I'm not saying we don't, but we need to understand the limitations. And we can't say, well, we did this because that's what the model said. That ain't going to work. It's not going to fly. You know, if you're successful and you say, okay, well, you know, I follow the model, then that's all right. But chances are you're not going to be able to say that. Bring this down just a little bit. Now, notice what Burke says here, and this is the most important thing I think that Burke says here about Tishi. He says that the most important component is barely mentioned. yeah, it's addressed cultural and political, et cetera, but the most important resource any organization has is its employees. It's also the most expensive. There's no question about that. But you aren't going to do things without the employees. And so employees need to be involved. We've talked about this in various and different sundry times and things. We talked about individual change and in some cases how difficult that is. But we've also talked about changing at the individual level. Most likely it's not going to affect the organization level because we're focused down here at a narrow space and we're not looking at the overall picture. Notice that the last he says here, that the individual level has a lower priority than the group level or the organization level. And I suppose that's to be expected. I don't think we should be surprised at that. If we looked at, and I think each of you in a response to that the individual level was the hardest place to change, or where change wouldn't be affected as much or implemented as much. And it's just it's difficult because we're working with, if you look at individual and we're thinking about that, we're working at the eaches. We're not working at a larger area or in a larger area. And he uses the word group here. We can extrapolate that to team or department or division, however we want to do that. And of course, organization level, pardon me, we certainly know. So regardless of whether or not it is most difficult to implement change at the individual level, it is individuals who are going to make the change successful or not successful. Or whether they're working in groups, teams, divisions, departments is irrelevant. They're still individuals. And there's still people we have to get them on board. Yes, it might be easier to get a team on board because the team can see the entire gamut and how that change is going to affect the team. Because the team, and I'm using team here, I'm not using another word, the team is, especially a self-managing team or a self-directed team, is responsible for all of its activities. So it's easy for it to see that this change is going to be beneficial to the entire team. It's difficult for an individual to see how a change that affects him or her is going to affect the entire organization or the group that he or she works in. And I'm using group to differentiate between that and team, which of course, as I think you all know, I think it should. Okay, enough of my soapbox there. Now, if Mark goes on to say here that this is really has some strengths. It includes many of the variables that are crucial to understanding organization change, and he changes that. He uses the term a little differently than I do, and changing organizations. And so, you know, that may be a little bit of wordplay between what I said and what he's saying. And maybe I changed it around because I like it better the way I said it. But we're essentially saying the same thing. And those are things that we need to look at. And again, go back to a statement we made before, and that is we have to make sure we've identified the key variables. Now, he being Burke compares the models that we have presented here. Notice that there are more similarities than there are dissimilarities. They're all based on open system theory. They do have some differences in how they address output. But notice here, they all emphasize the organization's purpose, its mission, and its strategy, or its strategy, it says here. But I like to roll those into one because I think that when you have purpose and mission, you have to have strategy. We're accounting for the structure of the organization and for its employees. And then we have some additional comparison here. Wise Board is the only one who makes leadership and rewards explicit. Now, let's stop here a second and talk about rewards. When we're into change, I don't think, again, this is me talking, I don't think we ought to think about rewards as something here being such as a bonus or something else that's tangible. We should think of this as seeing how people are rewarded in their job by making this change, how that change is going to be beneficial to the way they are able to function, to the way they're able to complete their tasks, and other things. So this kind of goes back to Hertzberg's theory, which we talked about, job content, what's in the job itself. So we're making the job much better. And we notice here differences. Nadler and Tishman emphasize congruence. TC emphasizes alignment. There's a lot of similarity in those words, where Weisbrod emphasizes leadership. Now, should we say that one of these is superior to the other? Well, let me say this. You are not going to get any type of organization change without leadership. You have to have leadership. I mean, that's pretty much evident in the first little scenario that Burke gives us about the vice president talking about the change that was coming at Columbia University. So if you don't have leadership, it's not going to happen. I don't dismiss these other two, but you just have to have that. You have to have leadership. Somebody needs to take ownership of what's going on and make sure that that's translated properly. Weisbrod and Nadler and Tishman give us contingency models. That's kind of a what if. What are we going to do if this happens or that happens or some other? And Tishi's is normative, which is obviously different than the other two. So I think in looking at these three, you need to see them as not competitors, but see them as adding something to the body of work and research in organizational change. And I wouldn't tell you that one is better than the other. I think that there are elements of all three that can be accepted, and maybe the best would be an amalgamation of the three. Well, I've come to the end of what I want to talk about here for chapter 9. We're going to take a short break. It's almost 5:11. We'll come back at 5:15 and we'll discuss chapter 10, which is a continuation in some way of what we're talking about here. Be the Burke-Litwin causal model of organization, performance, and change. So please come back at 5:15. Thank you. All right, 515, Chapter 10, Burke and Litwin's causal model of organization, performance, and change. Now, Burke gives a previous model summary, and I'm not going to discuss what's on this slide because we pretty much wrapped this up in the last chapter. Notice that the first one's Porras and Weisbrod, Nadler and Tushman are more about function, where Tichy is more about alignment. But notice the last bullet. None of them talk about or address cause and effect. And that's important. Now, we talk here about Litwin's model was inspired by McClelland's needs theory. And McClelland's needs theory talked about the need for power, the need for achievement, and the need for a relationship. And I think I've got that last one wrong. Affiliation. Thank you. That's kind of relationship in a way. And what the results here showed in McClelland's theory was significant differences with the achievement-oriented leader, that he or she had the highest performance and the highest morale. Now, let's stop and think about that just for a second. We know what power is, and we've heard that power can be absolute, and then power absolutely corrupts. In affiliation, often it is that the person is, the leader is building upon relationships, and he or she is more concerned with having good relationships. Now, in need for achievement, we can see this. People want to achieve, and they want to be in some way known for their achievements or have their achievements speak for themselves. That doesn't mean to say, at least as far as I'm concerned, that they are not, they don't seek power and that they don't seek affiliation. It's just that they don't seek those latter two in the same degree that they seek achievement. So he's talking here about Litwin and his model. And notice what the first thing starts off here with is climate. That the climate within an organization has some psychological priorities. Notice that they're based on the collective perceptions of those within the environment. Now, that's probably true, but we have to remember that climate, for the most part, has already been set, because climate sort of feeds off culture. And culture has already been set by the founders of the organization. Then he goes down here and talks about there are a number of variables in climate, and leadership, norms and values, etc., policies and procedures. And so we know that policies and procedure, for instance, which falls into Hertzberg's context part of his theory, his two-factor theory, are those kinds of things that have an impact on an individual. But if we make them better or friendlier, it's not going to cause the satisfaction rate to go up. It's cause that dissatisfaction to disappear. So what this is saying, and I think we have to think about this, is that if we have a positive climate, we're going to have things that are either employee friendly or no worse than employee neutral. If they're employee negative, we're going to have some problems. Now, here we're talking about performance, employee health. Those are also variables. And the question I think that we should ask ourselves is, should any of this on this slide be a surprise to us? Look at the bottom bullet. The better our working climate. Now, notice that does not say conditions, although conditions would be part of that. So the better this is, then we're probably going to have better performance. And that's something we need to pay attention to. So as I said before, we shouldn't really be surprised about what's on this slide at all. Now, this particular slide, I'm going to blow it up a second before I pull it up here. I'll come down just a little bit. This shows the organizational climate system. Notice in the middle here, more or less in the middle, we have climate profile. We have management systems, norms, values, manager practices, and then employee health and retention, and organization performance and development. This is all showing us what this is showing us what we had on the previous slide. Depicted a little bit differently, yes, I admit that, but really telling us what we've had. Now, notice here what he says. The Burke-Litwin model emerged as trying to understand how to bring about change at British Airways. And remember, we're talking here at British Airways, and we have to keep this in mind, was a revolutionary change. It was not evolutionary. Now, the first step, and some of you have alluded to this or written about it, I shouldn't say alluded to, have written about this in your reflection papers, that when Margaret Thatcher, who was then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, said this is going to go from a government-backed entity or government-controlled entity to free enterprise, going to have to sink or swim on its own. That in itself was radical, revolutionary. And then all the changes that had to be made, and what the biggest thing that had to be made there was a change in the culture. British Airways has talked a little bit more extensively in a later chapter. But this was a really radical type thing that went through here, revolutionary change. And by the way, notice here, the slide says Great Britain's Prime Minister. The actual name for the countries together, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland is and Wales, excuse me, is United Kingdom. It's been called various over periods of years or centuries, Britain or Great Britain or something else, but the United Kingdom is the proper term. Anybody says Great Britain, I'm certainly not going to be aggravated about it, but the proper term is United Kingdom. So what they learned here was the organization change is impacted more by its environment than anything else. And remember, when we talk about environment, we're speaking of the environment in which the organization operates and then its internal environment. So there are two different environments. The external environment probably creates more pressure on the organization for change because that's where the customers are, that's where government regulators are, that's where suppliers are, that's where stockholders are. So we have a number of people exerting influence on the organization from the outside. And then of course you have to have an environment, internal environment that is adaptable to be able to handle the change that's being forced upon it by the outside environment. So large scale change, mission, strategy, vision can come in there, and culture have more weight than how the organization is put together, or its management practices, and or its systems. Because of this bottom thing. If we change mission, strategy, culture, leadership, we're going to affect the entire organization, regardless. Structure may not do that. Changing structure may not do that. Whoops, excuse me. Now, this is just a graphic display. I'm going to blow this up just a little bit of the Burke-Lichtman model on organization performance. And we see here the external environment, and then that's at the top, and then moving down to leadership and management practices, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't need to go through all these, but we can see how they're interrelated. And as I want you to look on this slide, you will not see anything. Well, I've started to say something was incorrect. You will see structure, but you don't see structure in a more prominent place. In other words, you don't see structure over here in the middle. Although mission and strategy are very important, and maybe they should be in the middle too. But my point here is that structure is not taking a central place in this change model. Not to say it's not important, but it is important, but it's not taking a central position. And so somebody can say to me, well, the other things you have up here on the slide are not taking central positions either. Correct. But my point is to go back and buttress what we saw in the last slide, that we don't have structure superimposed someplace to make it more important than something else. Yeah, come down here just a little bit here. Now, this is James McGregor Burns model, transformational transactional dimensions, and recreates Burns' model. He being Burns talked about transactional and transformational leadership in 1978. And the reason I wanted to look at that, make sure I had that date in mind, is because I think that we have paid more attention to transformational leadership in the last 20 or so years than perhaps we did previous to that. That's not to say that Burns' work's not important or wasn't important. It was. It might have been groundbreaking. But the two things you want to take away from Burns is that he clearly stated transformational leads to or equates to change, and transactional actually equates to status quo. Now, and having said that, I want to stop a second and say, does that mean that leadership is more important than management? I think we should say they both have their places. You have to have management to keep the organization running. And management is concerned with the day-to-day things in an organization, whereas a leader tends to be visionary and looks at the big picture. So you need both of them. Somewhere in this text, I don't remember exactly where, Burke makes a point of saying, can an organization get along with leaders and not managers? And he says that organization has to have managers if it expects to continue running, and it can probably do without leaders for a period of time. And Burke is not saying, and neither am I, that leaders are not important and organizations can do without them. That's not the point. And the point is that we have to put these two categories, leadership and management, in separate boxes. And we should stay away from saying one is better than the other. We tend to say that leadership is better because it's visionary and all that goes along with that with that term. And I agree with that. And you need to have leaders because we need people to think in visionary terms. But we cannot denigrate managers. Managers are what makes things happen. And if a leader comes along and says, okay, we got to make this change, he or she's going to turn to the people that he or she has been relying on to make sure that the company runs on organization runs on on a daily basis. It's well oiled and well tuned for those people to implement the change that he or she wants. So we have to have both. And I guess we could say if you have a company that in some cases leadership takes on a greater importance, and I won't dismiss that, but you have to have managers. Now this slide gives us transformational and transactional. Well, this particular slide gives us transformational and transactional dimensions. I think if we look at this slide closely, we're probably going to see maybe a little bit more transformational than we're going to see transactional, although individual and organizational performance probably comes down to the transactional piece. And of course, leadership is extremely important. Organizations are not going to operate well without effective leadership. This particular slide is more about the transactional piece, management structure and policies and procedures and systems and things like motivation, etc. So while we have some of the same things on this slide we had on the previous slide, much of this is devoted around management. And so I guess the purpose, to me, the purpose of these two slides is to show the difference and also to show the need for both. All right, here he's showing the model. And we're talking here about the external environment. This is what kind of forces us to change. And look at the things that are impacting on us. We talked about these before: customers and conditions in the market, political circumstances, government regulations, financial conditions, changing technology, which we know today is probably changing as we speak, because we've seen this model continuously move, especially the technology piece. Now here we have two pieces that I think each of us knows about: mission and strategy. Mission says what we are, who we are, what our purpose is, and what it is we're going to try to achieve, goals. The strategy tells us how we're going to do that. And the mission and the goals will be articulated to the general public, but the strategy won't be. And so we need to think about it in those terms: mission, goals, our purpose, everybody and their brother and sister is going to see that because we're dealing with the outside world. But the strategy, how we're going to do this business is for us to figure out, and we're not going to share that with other people. Now here we are talking about leadership. And notice here what it says: provides direction, sometimes uses persuasion. Notice here what it says, this next thing, is that it has an interface with the followers. Leadership, or a leader has interface with his or her followers by acting as a role model, and then making sure that people receive the recognition that they're due. Intrinsic reward. I recognize you for a job well done. I'm not necessarily going to pay you a bonus or give you some other type of perk, but I'm going to recognize you for a job well done and single you out among your peers, and perhaps maybe within a larger organization. And I think this last one is probably as important as any of the rest of them. Providing employees the opportunity to learn. Now, it says new skills, but I would like to expand that beyond just skills and say to learn. Because if you learn, and we can think about this in a way of saying becoming educated, but not necessarily formal education, as you all are pursuing, but in the informal education, and becoming more informed, becoming a better, perhaps a corporate citizen, becoming perhaps a better citizen within the community, to be able to represent your company better, learn how to do that. So I'm expanding it beyond skills, and I'm not here to say we don't want to pay attention to skills, but we're expanding it beyond skills. So again, we're continuing with the model, and here we are with culture. And I think the first thing that we need to pay attention to with culture is it's the way we do things. And how the people we have are in conformance with what we want them to do, how we interact with them, communicate with them. So then we have explicit rules because they're written, everybody knows what they are. We have some that are implicit, it's simply understood. This is what we do, and this is how we do certain things. You're not going to find it written anyplace. But if you cross that boundary, you're going to find out about it. And we have certain values and certain customs, and by all means, we have our history. And often the history is embellished. What do I mean by that? Well, it takes on a little bit more than what it really is. So there's some heroic stories that go on there. Some sagas are told, etc. And, you know, as long as we're not actually fabricating something, that's probably okay. And if it stays within the organization, that's fine too. But these are the things that hold us together. And these are the things that we want to hold together. And if we have some group within the organization that doesn't conform to that, for whatever reason, then they become outcasts. And the organization will probably work to either eliminate them or segregate them in certain ways that they don't influence more than what is necessary. Continuing with the model. And here we are talking about structure. And we have the way we're organized. And I'm not going to talk about that. We have different departments that do different things. We may have units that are geographically separated in what they do and how they do it. And then we talk about things of structure tells us about responsibility. It tells us about reporting relationships. It tells us about authority. Structure won't necessarily, if we're looking at a structure, what we used to call in the Army a wiring diagram, won't necessarily tell us about decision making, which we could probably get from the wiring diagram, authority and responsibility, etc. But we in the organization know where decisions are made and how they're made, and that is part of structure. We talk about how we communicate. Direct communication, you'll see that on the wiring diagram as well. But direct communication and indirect communication are mass communication, and how we do that. And then what it is that we have set up that will help the organization meet its goals and objectives. And the structure tells us all that. It's set up in a way that we can see in some manner, either through a wiring diagram or something else, how the structure is and how the structure impacts all the things that we've talked about here. We're continuing with the model, and we're going to talk about here about management practices and what it is that managers do on a day-to-day basis to see that the strategy is moving, that we're implementing strategy the way it's supposed to be implemented, and that we're carrying out the objectives to reach the goals. So we're going to set objectives. We may set objectives, we may not have to set objectives depending upon where we are, and the objectives may be short-term or they may be long-term. Making sure that we're being efficient and effective in the use of the resources we have, and the resources includes raw material and the technology and the equipment that we have, and most of all, and most important, the employees. And then down here at the bottom, and I think it misses part of this too, and that is making sure that we pass out rewards, both extrinsic, bonus, some kind of perk or something else, a day off or whatever it happens to be. But also a manager should be passing out intrinsic rewards, recognizing people for a job well done. And then the last thing it tells us down here, management is different than leadership. And I've already beat that thing to death, and I don't want to do it again, but I think we need to understand that sometimes a leader can be a manager and vice versa. It doesn't happen all the time, and it doesn't happen in every situation, but it is possible, and I don't think we should forget that. Now here we're talking about systems. And notice here what we have down here at the bottom. Here we talk about information systems, reward systems, etc. And these come under things, policies and procedures and things that we have in place to tell us what to do and how to do certain things. But I want you to pay attention to control systems down here. And it talks a lot about things about performance appraisals and goals and budgets and things of that nature. The one thing it does not mention is, and this is, as far as I'm concerned, is somewhat in a system, and that is control of production. And you want to be able to have control of the production process from start to finish so that you can become aware of, and I've talked about this before, you can become aware of where problems exist. And you can fix the problem before you've produced an output that winds up being a piece of scrap because it can't be sold. So I would include a little bit more in external controls, but I'm not saying that what we have here is incorrect. It's just something that I would do. And by the way, that doesn't make it right either. Now, this is the climate. And look what we're talking about here. Note perception. Perception is reality. I think we need to pay attention to that. And here it talks about collective perception, but I would say individual perception as well. And it talks about different things here about how well they're treated. They use the term managed, but I like to use the term treated. I think that's a better way of stating it. That we're saying what we want, and the communication is clear. There's no confusion. Are we involving people in the decision-making process? And we need to ask a question: should they be? And if they should be, they need to be involved. Managed fairly, I think managed fairly goes back to how well they're treated. My term again, and I think those two probably should go together. If you're how well you're managed and how fairly you're managed, that should be the same thing. There shouldn't be any difference between those two. Do they get along with others? Do they work with them? And do those things need to be addressed? So that's all within the working climate. We need to think about that and its importance to what it is we do, etc. And this particular slide talks about a fit, employee fit for the job-based fit. Does the employee or the employees have the tasks, skills, and abilities and knowledge that fits the job vacancy or the job that they're occupying at that particular time? We want to have a good mesh there. Now, some of what we have on this slide, individual needs and values, security, achievement, etc., really talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and also Hertzberg's two-factor theories. So we need to be cognizant of task requirements along with what the individual has to possess to be able to do that, and then the individual needs. And this goes back to the Michigan studies and the Ohio State studies, which talked about initiation, which is task, and then human relations, which was how well the manager got along with his or her employees. Those things go hand in hand, and we have to make sure that we're working that way. Motivation, again, we may be bringing in things that from Hertzberg and Maslow, the needs for power, achievement, affiliation, back to McClellan. We need to look at individual and organization performance. The individual has to know, and I've always said this, has to know how he or she fits into the organization and how what he or she does supports the organization's overall mission, goals, strategy, and objectives. Everybody needs to know that. That goes from the CEO to the janitor, and there has to be some way that fits in. Other things are mentioned here: customer satisfaction, innovation, things of that nature. All important. Now this talks about support for the model's validity. Notice what it says here, that the model attempts to say what is, but it is not reality in and of itself. It is, as we said before, the external environment, the operating environment, that exerts the greatest influence on the organization. Notice here what he's saying in the model: the downward arrows carry more weight than upward pointing arrows. Why? Well, because if we even think about the fact that a downward arrow indicates negativity or an issue or a problem, then we should pay attention to it. Does that mean we dismiss the upper ones? No, it does not. It just means we need to pay more attention to the others. Now here we have more support for the validity, influence of the external factors. Notice here the linkage between external environment and organization culture, which we got from Hofstede and Gordon. Linkage between leadership and organization performance from Collins. By the way, if you don't recognize Collins, he's the gentleman who wrote the book From Good to Great. And then the linkage between the external environment and strategy from Prescott. So all of these things keep talking about the model and its validity. Transformational factors, and we have spent a good deal of time talking about them, how their importance, mission, strategy, leadership, etc. Mission, we talked about what it is we are. Strategies, how. Mission will influence strategy. You cannot have the strategy before you have the mission. And then we have to have strategy before we have structure. So you can't build something unless you know how we're going to do what we're going to do. Transactional. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on this because I think we all understand that. But notice that there must be linkages between management practices and climate, motivation, and performance. If there's some disconnect, we're going to have a problem. There must be a linkage between the reward system and the values and expectations and needs of individuals. More transactional factors. Notice here human resource management influences performance. I think that's pretty easy to say. And then management information systems do the same thing. They have to be user friendly. People have to be able to understand that. And finally, continuing with transactional factors, we have to have the job person match that we talked about before because that influences individuals' motivation. Now, why is that? If we have a person who comes into a job and we've set the expectations for the job too high, and so this person comes in and he or she has more experience in what's needed as well as more education in what's needed, pretty soon, and it's not going to be very long, that person's going to become unmotivated because the job is beneath his or her talents. So matching skills, abilities, and knowledge that the job requires to a person who is applying for the job are very important. If you have some disconnect there, it's going to be unmotivating. It's going to cause a problem. And then lastly, we've said this before, but we'll say it again, individual needs and values impact motivation. Well, what I'd like to do for the lecture discussion question is to have you to return to chapter 9 and look at the three models that we presented here. Nadler's, Tishy's, And well, I can't remember the third one. I want you to look at Weisbrod, Tushman, and Nadler, and then Tichy, and pick one that you think is the most influential and explain why it is, and be sure to support your explanation. So compare the three models in your own mind: Weisbrod, Nadler and Tushman, and Tichy, and tell us which of the three is more influential for a model for organization change, and why. And be sure to place this in your own words. Again, one more time to make sure I'm clear about this, and you are too. Do a comparison of the three models: Weisbrod, Nadler and Tushman, and Tichy, in your own mind, and then choose which of the three is the best model to implement organization change, and be sure to support your reasoning for that. Thank you, and good night.